The story, the garden, the serpent, the fall, and the gate. And then the gate slammed shut. But what if that was never the end? What if everything that matters, the real war, the real danger, began the moment they stepped outside? For over 1,000 years, a book survived, hidden inside Ethiopia's mountain monasteries. Sealed away from Western eyes, copied by hand in a language most scholars cannot read. It is called The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, and the title tells you everything. This was not a story of peace after the fall. This was a war. A war that began in a cave, with no light, no food, no certainty God was listening. A war where the enemy came, not with fire but with beauty, with gifts that looked like grace. A war that didn't end with the flood, or with Enoch, or with the empires of Rome. A war that is still being fought, right now, in your generation. In the first English translation of this book appeared, and quietly vanished within a decade. Not because scholars disproved it, but because what it contained was too uncomfortable for polite religion. It spoke too plainly of Satan's strategies, too vividly of the cost of obedience after Eden. Ethiopia never forgot this book. While the Western Church debated, Ethiopian Christians kept reading it as prophecy. So before we open the first chapter, let me ask you one question. What if the story you were told was only the prologue to a much greater war? Because if Genesis is where the war was declared, then what we're about to read is the battle plan. Stay with us, because what comes next will change how you see everything. This is the war after Eden, and it is far from over. It did not begin in a library or a university lecture hall. It began in the sand, where the desert swallows secrets and keeps them. Upper Egypt, early 20th century, where the desert gives back secrets only when it chooses. A royal tomb had been sealed for centuries beneath layers of wind and silence. The name on the stone belonged to an Egyptian noble, almost forgotten by history. His life had brushed against the edges of early Christian trade routes, connecting worlds.
Keep the lights steady.
When archaeologists broke the seal, they expected gold, expected the fragments of a forgotten dynasty. What they found instead was wrapped in linen, hidden in a concealed alcove. Not treasure in the way they had imagined, something far more unsettling. A bundle of ancient parchment preserved with extraordinary care, as if someone knew what they were protecting. The script was not hieroglyphic, not the language of pharaohs or priests of Amun. It was Ge'ez, the sacred liturgical language of Ethiopia's oldest mountain churches. Alongside the parchments lay a cedar box, ancient, carved, and sealed. Carved with a tree, a serpent, and two human figures in ancient reliefs.
I saw it.
The lead archaeologist later admitted in a private letter his shock at what he had found. It felt less like a tomb and more like a passageway between worlds. Inside the cedar box was a manuscript the Western world had not seen in centuries. Scholars would later call it the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. Ethiopia had another name for it. They simply called it the continuation. Because for them, it was never lost, never forgotten, never abandoned.
The serpent god.
When the
Unearthed.
first English translation
The text
appeared
is
in,
clear.
the world
We
briefly
must
took
seal
notice.
the tomb immediately.
The response from Western academia was swift, and it was brutal. Theologians labeled it pseudepigrapha, a forged text falsely attributed to ancient authors.
Do you agree with the findings here?
That single word was a death sentence in every academic circle
Perhaps we
that
should
mattered.
consult the new volume.
Seminaries quietly shelved it. Churches never mentioned it from the pulpit. Within a decade, the translation had faded, referenced only in footnotes, never taken seriously. But here is the question, the one that refuses to stay buried. Why does a forged text survive for over 1,000 years inside Ethiopia's most protected monasteries? Why does a fabrication get wrapped in linen and sealed inside a royal tomb? And why did it surface, only to vanish again as the world began to pay attention? When you trace the suppression carefully, the reasoning falls completely apart.
The form of the text.
The rejection was never based on
the
linguistic
content itself.
analysis alone, it was based on content. The book spoke too directly of Satan's methods, named his strategies with uncomfortable precision. It described what happened after Eden, the part Genesis does not show. And what it described beyond that gate was not peace but war.
Yes, the reason is etched into the very foundation.
One Ethiopian scholar, when asked
the
why the
patience
church
of
kept
the
the book,
stone,
gave an answer that stopped conversation cold. Genesis
The
is the
truth
prologue, and
endures
this book is the battle that
beyond
followed.
our knowing.
That sentence reframes everything. Western Christianity has been reading only the opening lines. And if that conflict is still unfolding, then ignorance is not innocence. Ignorance is a weapon handed directly to the other side of the war. The Ethiopian church understood this. That is why for them this was never curiosity. It was a field manual for spiritual warfare, preserved not out of tradition alone, but out of urgency, the urgency of people who knew the war was real. Here is what makes the suppression pattern so revealing. It keeps repeating. Sacred texts that challenge comfortable faith have always surfaced at the margins. They are preserved by people with no political power, only the quiet conviction it must not be lost. Ethiopia was never a footnote in the story of Christianity. It was one of the earliest nations. And in its highlands, in monasteries carved from solid rock, the full narrative was kept alive. Not just Genesis, not just the Gospels, but the parts in between that explain the war. And so the question the archaeologists faced is the same question we face now. Do we close it again and pretend we never saw it? Or do we dare to read what Adam and Eve wanted us to know? About the enemy who followed them into the darkness they actually walked through. Because what they found in the darkness was not what anyone expected. It was not despair and it was not defeat that they found.
Together.
Together.
It was the beginning of the longest, hardest, most important training any human soul has ever undergone. And it started in a cave, with no light, no warmth, and no certainty God remembered them. A cave that Ethiopia has always called the Cave of Treasures. And what happened inside those walls on the first night will tell you more about spiritual warfare than most sermons have ever dared to tell. The suppression looks deliberate when you trace it back carefully enough. The rejection wasn't based on evidence or linguistic flaws, it was based on theology. The book speaks too much of spiritual warfare, too plainly of Satan's strategies, too vividly of reality. It is not sanitized for polite religion, it is raw, urgent, and uncomfortably close. Which leaves us with the same choice the archaeologists had when they opened that cedar box. The gate did not close gently behind them, it shut like a verdict. One moment there was the garden, the fragrance, the light, the presence. That had been as natural as breathing, and then there was none of it. The air outside Eden was different, in a way that had no name yet. Thinner, sharper, as if the atmosphere itself had withdrawn its welcome. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and dry, nothing like the soft living earth before. Adam reached for Eve's hand. She was trembling though the air was not cold. They walked in silence, because there were no words yet for what had happened. And no map for where they were supposed to go from here. They walked until the land rose, and the stone walls of a hillside appeared. A cave opened in the rock, like a wound in the earth. It was low-ceilinged, cold, and without light. There was no beauty in it. This was not a sanctuary, it was the beginning of one. Yet the Ethiopian tradition gives this place a name, almost impossible to believe. The Cave of Treasures, named not for what it held but what it forged. But because of what would be forged inside it, in darkness and in grief. Inside the air was cold and damp, shadows clung to the walls. Adam and Eve had never known darkness before, not like this. In Eden, even night had been luminous, the presence of God filling every shadow. Here the black was absolute, pressing against them like a physical force. He reached back for Eve and pulled her inside, and they stood together unable to see. Then Adam did something the enemy had not anticipated. He fell to his knees. Not quietly, not with dignity, but the way a man weeps when everything is gone. Eve knelt beside him, and her voice broke against the darkness.
We are broken.
The text records this moment without flinching. It does not rush past it. The path back to God does not begin with composure. It begins with collapse. And it was in that collapse, at the precise moment of deepest weakness, that the enemy arrived. He had not been idle since the expulsion. He did not come with fire, he did not come with armies. He came with something far more precise, a sound designed to destroy. In the silence of the cave, a noise began to build. Low at first, almost like wind, then rising into something with no natural source. A wail so sharp and so deep,
Stop!
it seemed to enter the
Please make it
bones.
stop!
Do you hear
Eve
it?
pressed herself against Adam. Adam
do.
pressed his hands
It's
against
close.
his ears.
Stay hidden.
But the sound was already inside him, carrying a specific emotional frequency. Not just fear, but the particular despair of someone who believes they are abandoned.
The shadows
Look at
watch.
what you have become,
The ancient
the voice
stones
said from
hold
the
secrets.
darkness.
Speak softly, and they will listen.
From the garden to a hole in the ground, from glory to dust. He is
I
not
heard a
coming
voice
back for you.
whisper your
You made
fate.
your choice, now live with it.
You will be alone.
These were not random taunts. Every line was aimed at a specific wound. The wound of separation, the wound of shame, the wound of finality. But something happened in that cave the enemy had not calculated. Adam lifted his head not because the pain had stopped but despite it. But beneath the grief, beneath the shame, something older than the fall was still alive. The memory of God's voice, not a doctrine, not a concept, but a memory. And from that memory,
The mountain
through cracked lips,
protects.
Adam began to pray.
The darkness holds me.
O Lord, do not forsake the work of your hands, we are still yours.
God,
Eve's
hear
voice
our
joined
prayer.
his, and the darkness in the
Grant us
cave
strength
seemed to
and peace,
recoil.
Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
The cave of treasures became in that moment more than a shelter. It became the first altar outside Eden, the first battleground where prayer was a weapon. The enemy had expected their despair, he had not expected their worship. He had studied their weakness, cataloged every wound, every fear, every doubt. But he had not accounted for the one thing that cannot be
keep us
strategized
safe.
against.
Keep us safe.
Amen.
God, my God,
Genuine surrender to God,
mercy on
not
me, a
performance,
sinner.
not formula,
Grant me
but actual
peace.
broken trust.
Amen.
That is what the Cave of Treasures teaches, before anything else. The path back does not begin with strength, it begins with honesty. The willingness to kneel in the dark before you can see any answer. My own reading of this passage stopped me, held me completely still. Because
Do
I
you
have
remember how
sat
long
in
we've
my
been
own
here?
version of that cave,
Ages.
most of us have.
But it feels like yesterday.
I know.
That place where the noise outside stops, and you are left with only yourself. And the question is always the same: will you pray, or will you spiral? Adam chose to pray, and in that choice the cave became sacred ground. That is the first lesson of the war. Your response to darkness is your weapon. Not the absence of pain, but what you do with the pain.
The words
The
resonate with the
Ethiopian
truth
monks
of
who
our
kept
fathers.
this text
We have
understood
found it,
what
the
most
sign.
seminaries missed.
It is written,
God,
Faith is not
Give us
the absence of the
strength.
cave, Faith is what you build inside it.
We seek your protection.
In the next chapter, the enemy abandons the darkness and tries something worse. He stops looking like the enemy and starts looking like an answer. The most dangerous version of the enemy is not the one you can see. It is the one who arrives wearing the face of grace. The book records that after the first night of prayer, something changed. The enemy did not return with wailing, he returned with light. He came as something Adam and Eve had not seen since Eden. A being of radiant light, beautiful, calm, and apparently full of compassion. And he spoke first, not with accusation but with apparent sympathy. I saw what happened to you, and I have come to help.
Tell me you brought the doctor.
You do not deserve this suffering. God
Your
would not
pain is
want
not
this for
your
you.
fault. You do not deserve this.
The text describes this moment with extraordinary precision, almost clinical detail. The
I
enemy did
understand
not
your
lie
fear.
about everything. That is
The
not how it
danger is
works.
real, but I can guide you through it.
He used true things, real pain, real loss, real longing, as the doorway. The suffering was real, the longing for Eden was real, the grief was real. But the destination he was pointing toward was away from God. He offered them a shortcut, back to comfort, back to warmth, back to relief.
Wait,
But the shortcut bypassed the
it?
one thing
Something
that
is
would
here.
actually restore
Back.
them.
I see it. Are you sure?
The slow, necessary process of being broken and rebuilt by God Himself. This is the pattern the book names clearly, and it repeats across all 6 chapters. Attack with darkness first, and if that fails, attack with false light. If fear does not break them, offer comfort that costs them everything.
the
The
ancient
Ethiopian
words tell
tradition
of a
has a
prophecy.
specific name for
We
this,
must
the
heed
mask
them
of the
now,
enemy.
for the signs are upon us.
When the enemy cannot destroy you through despair, he tries to redirect you through something that looks like mercy, but moves you away from the altar. Adam recognized it, but only just barely, and only after Eve had
Don't.
already stepped
You can't.
forward.
I have to.
The book does not blame Eve, it records the moment with compassion. She was tired, she was grieving, and the offer looked exactly like relief.
I must warn you of the darkness to come, my
Adam
friend.
called her name,
Stay safe.
and in his voice was
Stay hidden.
everything he knew.
And never forget who you are.
You shouldn't be here.
Not a command, not a
I know.
rebuke, but a question that
I had to
carried
see
the
you one
answer.
last time.
I must know.
Where is he trying to take you, and what will it cost?
What is the path forward?
Those 2 questions, the book suggests, by the entire spiritual armor. Where is this leading me, and what is
you
the
think he
actual
will come
cost?
back?
He will.
Not where does it feel like it is leading, where does it actually go? Eve stepped back from the entrance, and the figure at the door changed. The warmth drained from its presentation, what remained was cold and calculating. This is what the book calls discernment, seeing the destination, not the presentation. Not is this offer painful, but where will I be if I accept it? The enemy always offers the right things through the wrong door. Rest, yes, but not the rest that comes from surrender to God. Comfort, yes, but not the comfort that bypasses the altar entirely.
We have shelter here.
We'll stay
The cave
as long
held
as we
them
can.
because they chose to stay and be held. I have sat with this chapter longer than any other, for a reason. Because the mask of the enemy is not a medieval concept. It is the primary operating strategy in every generation without exception. The offer that looks like exactly what you need, arriving at the wrong door.
The knowledge you seek is
Ask
not
the two
written,
questions
but felt
Adam asked,
deep
every
in
single
the
time
mountain's
without
heart.
exception. Where is this truly leading me, and what will it actually cost? Those two questions, this ancient book insists, will never mislead you. Not if you ask them honestly, before you step through the door. Chapter 3 ends with Adam and Eve still in the cave, together. Still in the cave, still praying, still choosing the altar over the door. Time passed inside that cave, and it was not wasted time. The book records something that most readers pass over too quickly. Adam and Eve did not simply survive the cave, they were shaped by it. The grief did not leave them, but something grew alongside it. A capacity for God that had not existed before the fall. This is the paradox the Ethiopian text names with precision and courage. The depth of what you can receive from God is proportional to the depth
Keep watch.
of the preparation you have
I
been
am
willing to
ready.
endure before it.
The time has come to
The
take
cave
the next
was never
step.
their punishment. The cave was always their
I am
preparation.
ready, my brother.
But the book does not stop there. It goes considerably further. It records the precise moment God Himself descended into that cave. Not as a concept, not as a theology, but as a presence. He came to where they were, not to where they wished they were. Not to the garden they had lost, but to the cave they had found. This is the covenant moment, the one the text marks with reverence.
It is here.
God did not abandon what He made, even after what they had done.
We are finally home.
He entered the cave, and in entering it He made it holy. The sacred covenant the text records is not abstract or theological. It is personal, spoken directly to two broken people in a cave.
It is true.
I will not leave
After
you
all
without a
this
way
time,
back,
it is true.
the text records. The path will be long, and it will cost you everything. But you will not walk it alone, and the end is already written. This is the covenant that changes everything, in the entire narrative. Not because the suffering ends here, it does not end yet. But because from this moment they know they are not abandoned.
Do you see that?
I do.
There is a war
must
being
move
fought over
faster.
them, and God has chosen a side. My own reading of this covenant passage shifted something permanent in me. I had always read the expulsion from Eden as a story of loss. This text reframes it as the beginning of a different story.
God, hear our plea.
The story of
Grant
two
us
people who
strength,
lost
O merciful
everything
one.
and found God anyway. Not in a garden, but in a cave, on cracked stone, in the dark.
We must choose the path shown to us.
The war inside the
Even if
cave
it leads
is now
into the
inseparable
darkness.
from the covenant. You cannot fully understand the war without understanding the covenant behind it. The enemy attacks with such precision because he knows what is at stake. He is not attacking your comfort, he is attacking your covenant. Not your happiness, your capacity to remain in relationship with God. This is exactly why the Cave of Treasures was worth preserving. It names the real target, and in naming it, it arms you. And it arms you not with fear, but with hard, clear clarity. If you have been sitting in your own cave, this chapter is for you. The covenant was not made with perfect people, in a perfect place. It was made with broken people, in the darkest place they had ever known. And that is what makes it the most important covenant in the book. Because it proves that the war does not disqualify you from the covenant. The cave does not disqualify you. The cave is where the covenant lives. Ethiopia kept this book for centuries because they lived this truth. A people who prayed in stone rooms, carved from mountains, for over 1,000 years. They understood something the comfortable Western church had long since forgotten. The covenant is not for the comfortable, it is for the caves. And every cave you have ever sat in has been preparing you. There are some losses that do not happen all at once. They happen one small step at a time, one compromise at a time. One descent that feels so gradual, you do not realize you are moving. Until you look up and find you cannot see the mountain anymore. This is the story of Seth's children, the most painful chapter in the war. Not because the enemy was clever, but because the people who fell were not evil. They were simply drawn toward something real, something human, something beautiful. After Abel's death and Cain's exile, the grief in Adam and Eve's household settled. Like a second exile, but into that grief, God gave them another son. They named him Seth. The name means appointed, chosen, set apart. From his earliest days, Seth was different, not performing righteousness for an audience. Different in the way of someone who had heard something real and organized his life around it. Adam recognized it and understood what it required of him as a father.
The knowledge within these pages is sacred.
Not
Listen
comfort and
closely,
not shelter
for it will
from
light your
hardship,
path.
but transmission of the
understand.
sacred memory. The passing of the covenant, the promise, the war, and the weapons forged in the cave.
Yes, it is the only
Under
way
Adam's
now.
guidance,
He is right.
Seth and those who gathered
We move
around him
together
made a
at
decision.
dawn.
They withdrew from the lowlands, they ascended to the high places. The high places became their dwelling, clean air, untouched by Cain's bloodline. From the heights they could see the plain spreading out beneath them. Fertile, green, alive with people building their own version of Eden without God. The sons of Seth looked down at those plains and turned away. They had something the valley could not offer: memory, covenant, the songs of the first generation. And they guarded these things the way you guard a fire in a storm. The mountain became known as the Mountain of Holiness, set apart at personal cost. They built altars on the high places and sang in the language Adam had taught them.
The mountain remembers.
They kept the sacred stories alive by telling them before the children could question whether they mattered. And for generations this was enough. The mountain held, the covenant thread moved forward. But holiness is not a destination you arrive at and then stop moving. It is a direction you must keep choosing every single day. Against every current that runs the other way, and the current below is growing stronger. Cain's descendants had not been idle. Music rose from the valley unlike anything before. Not the worship songs of the high places, simple, unadorned, oriented toward heaven. This was something different. It had a pulse that moved through the body before the mind could evaluate it. Instruments of bronze and iron, crafted with a skill the mountain people had never needed. There were festivals in the valley, lights at night, colors during the day. The daughters of Cain moved through the celebrations with a freedom that looked remarkably like joy. It started with curiosity. That is almost always how it starts. Not with a decision to abandon the mountain, but with a question. What is that sound? Is it really as dangerous as we were told? One young man descended, told himself that looking was not the same as joining. Told himself that he could carry the mountain's values into the valley and remain unchanged. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet, and he returned.
Hinges. I saw a city of light, so vast and bright.
He returned with
Light?
stories that
Yes,
made the
a
valley
world of
sound
wonders
less like
beyond
a
our
threat.
mountains.
How is this possible?
Then two young men descended, then a group, then the group stopped returning. The sons of Seth saw the daughters of Cain, and what they saw undid years of formation. Not merely in appearance, but in presence, in confidence, in the quality of aliveness. That comes from a people who have decided this world is all there is. The sons of Seth had been raised to hold the world loosely, as a temporary dwelling. But the daughters of Cain were not holding anything loosely, they were fully here. And that fullness, that unapologetic, embodied presence, was more magnetic than any warning. They took quiets from among them, one by one, then in groups. The Book of Enoch speaks of this period as the doorway through which corruption flooded the earth. Not because the women of Cain's line were monsters, but because the unions represented something more. The enemy had been engineering this from the moment he watched Adam receive those 3 gifts. A bloodline merger, the holy and the profane woven together not by force but by desire. By the oldest and most effective mechanism the enemy has ever deployed.
Welcome, friend.
The willingness of the
Hey,
consecrated
rest
to
with us.
trade their inheritance for something
glad
that
you're
felt
here.
like the longing. The offspring of these unions were unlike anything the world had seen. The Nephilim, giants in stature, fierce in strength, dominant in war. But morally ignored, disconnected from the covenant memory that had shaped Seth's line. They filled the land with violence and consumed its resources with an appetite that recognized no boundary. And slowly, so slowly that no single generation could see the full arc of it, the mountain grew quiet. The altars were abandoned. The songs of the high places were drowned beneath the drums of the valley. The names of the covenant were forgotten. The stores became myths. Then they became embarrassments. Then they disappeared entirely from the memory of a people who had once been appointed to carry them forward into every generation that came after. Here is where the prophetic lesson cuts so deep, it leaves a mark. The sons of Seth did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were drawn by something real, something human, something understandable. The longing for a connection, for beauty, for belonging, these are not sinful desires. They are among the most sacred impulses God placed in the human soul. The enemy did not corrupt them by making them want wrong things. He corrupted them by offering the right things through a door that led away from the source. And the moment the sons of Seth stepped through that door, they did not only lose themselves. They lost the generation that came after them, and the generation after that. Holiness compromised does not stay compromised. The distance is not maintained by geography. It is maintained by decision, daily, costly, countercultural decision. The moment that daily decision is replaced by assumption, the descent has already begun. You simply have not felt it yet. This is not ancient history. This is the story of every generation that inherited a sacred identity. And slowly, reasonably, one step at a time, traded it for the sound of the valley's music. The mountain songs are still being drowned out. The altars are still being abandoned. The stories are still being forgotten, replaced by narratives that say the high place was an illusion. That the valley is where the real life is. The enemy's strategy has not changed. He does not need to storm the mountain. He only needs to make the valley look more alive. And when the mountain finally fell silent, the last song of Seth's children faded into the lowland noise. The earth itself began to cry out. The Book of Enoch records what happened next. The violence of the Nephilim, the corruption of the merged bloodlines, accumulated into a weight the earth could no longer carry, and heaven heard it. Walking in a world that had almost entirely forgotten the God of a mountain, he was called into the presence of the one who had heard the earth's cry. And what he was shown there would become the most urgent prophetic warning in all of human history. A warning that Ethiopia preserved in full, while the rest of the world lost it.
The judgment is near.
And what he was shown there, that
Prepare
warning is
yourselves.
what comes next. A warning that reads less like ancient text, and more like a description of our own moment. There was one man left who still remembered the mountain, not as a location, as a way of being, seventh from Adam in the line of Seth. Which means he carried in his blood the memory of the cave, the covenant, the three gifts given in the wilderness, and the songs of the high places.
The mountain watches in silence.
He lived in a world that had almost entirely forgotten all of it. The valley had won. The altars of Seth's line stood empty against the sky. Monuments to a devotion that the surrounding culture had decided was either irrelevant or dangerous. And yet Enoch walked with God. Genesis gives us that single sentence and moves on. But the Ethiopian manuscripts open the door behind it and show us what it actually cost. It cost everything that walking with the crowd would have given him. Acceptance, safety, the comfort of being unremarkable. Enoch was not a recluse. He lived among people. He watched the Nephilim fill the land with violence. He watched the knowledge the fallen ones had brought spread like fire through dry wood. Sorcery, the crafting of weapons, forbidden astronomy, blurring the line between worship and idolatry. He watched a generation consume itself on power it had never been designed to hold.
I have seen the path ahead, and we are not ready. But
And
we
he did
must
not
be.
go silent. The Book of
enough.
Enoch records that
Not
he
with our hearts
preached,
as they are. Do not be deceived by their forms, for the truth lies
not from
within
a
the light
position
of your
of
hearts.
safety, but from the middle of the
Do not
corruption
give in to their
itself.
fear.
Before we go further, we need to understand who the Watchers actually were. The Western Church has spent centuries treating this portion of Scripture as allegory or embarrassment. But the Ethiopian canon never flinched from it. They took it seriously. The Watchers were angelic beings, guardians appointed by God to watch over humanity. They had authority, they had proximity to the divine, and they abandoned it. Not through a single moment of weakness, through a coordinated, premeditated act of rebellion. The Book of Enoch names their leader and describes the oath they took among themselves. Each one swore that none would turn back, that if they fell together. It was not passion that brought them down, it was a pact. A deliberate, eyes-open decision to cross a boundary God had set and accept the consequences. so that no single one of them would bear this shame alone. They descended, they took quiets from among the daughters of men. And the offspring of those unions, the Nephilim, were unlike anything the earth was designed to hold. But the Watchers brought something more dangerous than their children. They brought knowledge. Specific, targeted, deliberately chosen, things God had withheld not out of cruelty but wisdom. Azazel taught the crafting of weapons, Semizah taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. The Book of Enoch calls this knowledge that led astray, not because information is evil, but because knowledge without covenant is a loaded weapon handed to a child. The earth began to cry out, not metaphorically, but as a literal description. The blood of the innocent rose like a voice, and heaven heard it. 4 archangels brought the cry before the throne. The earth is crying out. The corruption has reached a point of no return. God's response was surgical. First, Enoch was called, a man of flesh summoned into the courts of heaven, to receive a decree he would carry back and deliver to beings of celestial power. He was shown the storehouses of the winds, the foundations of the earth, the place where the fallen ones were already being held, in anticipation of judgment. He stood before the Watchers, beings who had once stood in the presence of God, and chosen to abandon that presence, and he delivered the verdict. Not with an army, not with power that matched theirs in any visible way, with words.
Your crimes against the pact
You
are
will find no
unforgivable.
peace. You will
Your
find no
sentence,
forgiveness. Your
exile.
petition has been denied. Your children the Nephilim will perish. The knowledge you corrupted will testify against you. You will be bound in the valleys of the earth until the day of the great judgment.
The time has come.
One man surrounded by fallen giants,
for they are
speaking a
truth.
sentence that would seal their fate. This is what walking with God actually looks like, when the world has walked away from Him. Not comfort, not insulation from danger, the terrifying, clarifying courage of someone who knows exactly whose voice they are carrying. But the judgment on the Watchers was only the first act. The earth itself required cleansing. Noah enters the record here, and the Ethiopian tradition adds layers his story almost entirely omits. Genesis tells us Noah was righteous and blameless in his generations. That phrase, blameless in his generations, has been read for centuries as a moral description alone. But the Hebrew and Ethiopian traditions both suggest it carries a second meaning. To me, the word translated as blameless also speaks of physical wholeness and untainted lineage. Noah's family had not been drawn into the bloodline mergers that had corrupted humanity's inheritance. In a world where the image of God in man had been systematically distorted, Noah's line remained. A vessel through which the original design could be carried forward. This is why he was chosen. Not because he was perfect in behavior, though his righteousness was real and costly.
The gate is closed.
But because his line remained capable of carrying the promise given in the garden to the woman, and that the enemy had been engineering to destroy. ever since the gate of Eden closed.
The time is at hand. Prepare,
Noah preached for
the sign
decades
is
while he
rising.
built the ark,
Every
rising
beam, every
plank by
joint,
plank above the plain. A visible, unavoidable declaration that the world as it existed was operating on borrowed time.
He's building a boat. Is it gonna rain?
The people around him did not grow afraid. They grew contemptuous. Why believe in a God you cannot see when you can build cities with your own hands?
The ark. What is that? Where did it come from?
Why submit to
Stop the
ancient
work.
covenant
Look at it.
restrictions
It
when the
stands
knowledge
against
given
our
has
planning.
made us architects of our future? The distance between their logic and our own is smaller than we would like to believe. Then the sky opened, not rain as the earth had known it. The fountains of the deep broke apart, as if creation itself was participating in the judgment. The waters rose without mercy or pause. Cities built across generations vanished in days. The Nephilim, those giants who had filled the land with dominance, fell beneath the water. Their strength, which had seemed so absolute, was revealed for what it had always been. Borrowed, temporary, built on a foundation the creator of foundations had decided to withdraw. Here is the way peak the Ethiopian tradition has been pointing toward, across all the chapters. The flood was not only judgment, it was mercy. If the corruption had continued unchecked, there would have been no untainted humanity remaining. No vessel for the Messiah, no fulfillment of the promise made to even her greatest failure. The flood was a surgical intervention to preserve the one thing the enemy worked to destroy. The covenant line, the thread, the living connection between the promise and its fulfillment. God did not flood the earth because he was angry, he flooded it because he was faithful.
You must understand.
But here is what the Ethiopian manuscripts insist we do not miss. The spirits of the Nephilim did not perish with their bodies.
The passage reads,
The book of Enoch is explicit. The disembodied spirits became what Scripture calls unclean spirits. Restless, bodiless, still oriented toward corruption, seeking vessels, seeking gaps in human devotion. The flood cleansed the earth of their physical presence. It did not end the spiritual war. The enemy recalibrated, as he always does, studying what had worked and what had failed. His strategies would evolve into something that did not require fallen angels descending from the sky. Something that would wear the face of progress, of enlightenment, of scientific advancement. The same forbidden knowledge, wrapped now in the language of innovation and delivered through screens. The pattern is not buried in the past, it is repeating right now in our generation. With the same goal it has always had, to distort the image of God in humanity. And that is why Ethiopia's monasteries still matter, high in the mountains, in chambers of living rock. The Watchers' rebellion did not look like rebellion from the inside, it looked like knowledge. The corruption before the flood did not announce itself as corruption, it announced itself as civilization.
The days I spoke of are not in the past.
And if
They are
Enoch's
already
warning
upon
is
us.
true, the days of
Turn
Noah
and
are
see
not
the
behind
signs.
us but before us. The answer to that question determines everything that comes next. Then the most urgent question is not whether we are advanced enough to handle what is coming. It is whether we are awake enough to recognize it for what it actually is. The flood ended one age, but the war it was part of did not end with the water. It is still being fought on every mountain that remains, in every soul that still remembers, and in every generation that must decide, as Seth's children decided, as Noah decided, as Enoch decided, which voice they will carry into the world, and which kingdom they are willing to suffer for. The answer to that question determines everything that comes next. If this investigation is stirring something real in you, this channel exists for you. We began in a tomb, a cedar box sealed in the Egyptian sand. Wrapped in linen, hidden in silence, waiting for a generation ready to open it. We have walked with Adam and Eve through the gate that closed behind them. We have knelt with them on the stone floor of the cave.
God, grant me the strength to
where
endure
the first
darkness
prayer outside Eden
and
was prayed
guide
in
me
the dark.
through the path ahead.
We have stood in the wilderness and watched the mask slip from the enemy's most beautiful deception. We have traced the covenant through days of preparation, through three gifts that pointed forward across centuries, to a manger in Bethlehem and across outside Jerusalem. We have watched an entire generation descend from the mountain, one small step at a time, until the songs of the high places were swallowed by the valley's noise.
You are guilty of the crimes of corruption.
We have
and
stood with
betrayal of
Enoch in the
sacred
courts
trust.
of heaven and
Let the
heard him
judgment
deliver a
be made.
verdict. To beings who once stood in God's presence and chose to walk away from it. And we have watched the flood rise, not as the rage of an abandoned God, but as the mercy of a faithful one who would not allow the covenant line to be erased. This is the story they buried, not because it was false, because it was too true. Too precise about how the enemy operates, too clear about what is at stake. Too honest about the cost of holiness in a world that has decided. The valleys where the real life is, but the story does not end with the flood. It ends, or rather arrives at its conclusion, in the final pages of a book called Revelation, where a king returns, not as the suffering servant of the Gospels this time, as the conquering king whose robe is dipped in victory, whose voice is like the sound of many waters, whose feet are like burnished bronze refined in fire, and on whose thigh is written a name. That every empire, every Babylon, every system of corruption will one day be required to read. King of kings, Lord of lords, from Adam's cave to the throne the thread is never broken. Not when Cain's bloodline filled the earth with violence, not when the watchers crossed heaven's boundary, not when Seth's children descended from the mountain and forgot the songs, not when the flood rose and the earth groaned under the weight of what humanity had become, not when the manuscripts were sealed in tombs and labeled too dangerous for polite religion. The thread held, because the one who spun it does not begin things he does not intend to finish. You are not a spectator of this war, you are a participant in it.
They will hear our music.
The same strategies the enemy deployed in the cave, in the wilderness, on the mountain, are active right now. In your generation, in your culture, in the specific shape of your longing. The question is not whether the war is real, the question is whether you will engage it. With the weapons that have always worked, the word held in memory, the covenant guarded in the dark. Adam and Eve did not win because they were strong, they won because they were loyal. In the moments when loyalty cost them everything visible, Enoch did not stand because he was fearless. He stood because he knew whose voice he was carrying, and that knowledge was stronger than his fear.
You laugh now.
Noah did not build the ark because the crowd affirmed him.
But I must build. He's mad.
He built it because the word he had received was more real than the contempt surrounding him. These were not superhuman people, they were people who made a decision in a world gone wrong. To hold the thread, to keep the covenant, to carry the promise forward, one faithful generation at a time. That is what is being asked of us now, not perfection. Just this, the daily, costly, countercultural decision to remember who we are and refuse to trade it for anything the enemy is offering. The cave of treasures is still open, the manuscripts are still there. In the mountains of Ethiopia, in the ancient text, in the story. Waiting for the generation willing to take it seriously, do you close it again? Or do you carry what is inside it into the war that is already underway? The King is coming, the gates will open again, not to let us out but to welcome us home. Until that day, the thread is in your hands, hold it.
I believe this passage describes
if this journey has moved something in you, you are exactly who this channel exists for.
In the fresco.